Stop! I'll buy those 3 fat widows. Without them, I'd be dead, the Amish man said. Dust swirls in the mining town's auction yard. A trader laughs cruelly, trying to sell 3 broken widows for whiskey. The crowd jeers, calling them useless, until a plain, bearded stranger steps forward, his voice cutting through the noise. He owes them his very life, but saving them may cost him everything. Church bells toll as whispers of scandal spread. Jail keys rattle when the sheriff takes him away. And as flames rise against the night, one truth burns brighter than the fire. These women hold the deed to the only spring in town. Water the railroad will do anything to steal. They gave him mercy once. Now he must stand against greed, shame, and fire itself to protect them. Will compassion and faith be enough to overcome a whole town's cruelty? Or will the widows lose everything again, this time for good? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of the Colorado mining town. 3 women huddled together, their worn shawls pulled tight against the autumn chill. Hannah Yoder kept her eyes fixed on the wooden planks beneath her feet, trying to shut out the cruel laughter from the crowd gathered in front of the saloon. "What'll you give me for these 3?" the trader called out, his whiskey-soured breath cutting through the air. "Ain't much use for women their size, but maybe someone needs help moving boulders." More laughter rippled through the crowd. Clara Whitcomb's shoulders stiffened, her jaw clenched tight. Beside her, Ruth Ellsworth whispered a prayer, her voice trembling. The 3 widows had faced hardship before, but nothing like this public humiliation. "I'll give you 2 pennies, someone shouted. "Half-empty bottle of whiskey," called another. Hannah felt her cheeks burn hot with shame. After losing their husbands in the mine collapse, they'd struggled to survive. Now this trader, who'd offered them work in his shop, revealed his true intentions, to parade them like cattle at auction. "Look at the size of 'em," the trader guffawed, gesturing wildly. "Might as well be selling 3 bears." The crowd pressed closer, their mockery growing bolder with each cruel bid. Hannah squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could disappear into the dusty ground. Then a clear, steady voice cut through the jeering, "Stop!" The laughter faltered. Through the gap in the crowd stepped a tall man in plain, dark clothes, his beard neat, his bearing calm but firm. Hannah recognized him instantly, the Amish traveler they'd sheltered years ago. "I'll buy those 3 fat widows," he announced. "Without them, I'd be dead." A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The trader's smirk wavered as the stranger, Aaron Zook, moved forward with measured steps. "These women," Aaron continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street, "took me in during the great blizzard 2 winters past. When my mule went lame and I was near frozen, they shared their food and shelter without question." Hannah remembered that night, the howling wind, the stranger collapsed in their doorway, ice crusting his beard. They'd never asked his name, just pulled him inside and warmed him by their fire. The trader recovered his voice, though it had lost some of its swagger. "Fine tale, friend, but business is business. $50 each, not a penny less." Aaron reached into his coat, laying out a small pile of coins on a nearby barrel. The metallic clink seemed to echo in the hushed street. "This is all I have," he said simply. "But I also offer my mule, a fine animal worth twice that amount." The crowd muttered, their entertainment turning to something else. Scandal, perhaps, or unwanted shame of their own. A plain-dressed Amish man offering to buy 3 widows? It wasn't natural. Clara's voice cut through the whispers, sharp as a knife. "We ain't for sale to anyone." But Aaron met her fierce gaze steadily. "No, you're not, but I owe a life debt, and I aim to pay it." Ruth clutched Hannah's arm. "Why would he do this?" she whispered. Hannah couldn't answer. She stared at Aaron Zook, remembering how he'd sat at their table that long-ago night, eating bowl after bowl of her stew without a word of judgment about her size or her circumstances. He'd left them a beautifully carved wooden box as thanks. She still kept her sewing needles in it. The trader looked between Aaron's calm face and the watching crowd, sensing his sport had soured. The sun dipped lower, painting the scene in shades of amber and lengthening the shadows of shame that had fallen across the townspeople's faces. Aaron stood quietly, waiting. His offer hung in the air like the dust motes dancing in the slanted sunlight. The widows held their breath, caught between humiliation and hope, while the town watched this strange tableau unfold in the fading light of day. Morning sunlight crept across the auction yard, casting long shadows behind the barrels and crates. The trader paced in front of Aaron, a calculating gleam in his bloodshot eyes. "Come to think of it," the trader drawled, $75 each seems more fitting. Fine workers like these." His voice dripped with mockery as he gestured toward the three widows. Aaron stood unmoved, his quiet presence drawing curious stares from the lingering townsfolk. "I remember clear as day," he said, his voice carrying across the yard, "how these women saved my life. Hannah Yoder's hearth bread gave me strength when I couldn't stand. Clara Whitcomb split firewood for hours to keep me warm. Ruth Ellsworth's hymns lifted my spirit through that terrible night." The crowd grew still, some shuffling their feet in discomfort. Hannah's cheeks flushed at the mention of her bread, while Clara's stern expression softened slightly. Ruth clasped her hands together, remembering those hymns sung in the howling wind. "I can pay in installments," Aaron continued steadily, "and I'll work at the railroad yard to cover the rest. These women showed me mercy when I had nothing. I aim to do the same." The trader spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Fine," he snarled, snatching Aaron's coins and mule's reins. "But you'll regret meddling where you don't belong." He stormed off, muttering threats under his breath. Heavy bootsteps approached from the saloon's direction. Sheriff Clay Dobbs planted himself in front of Aaron, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Now see here, Zook," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You're stepping into other folks' business. Them widows' land sits on the only fresh spring for miles." His eyes narrowed. "No outsider's going to keep that water from proper use." Aaron met the sheriff's gaze without flinching. "The law says different, Sheriff Dobbs." "Laws can change," Dobbs replied, touching the badge on his chest. Behind him, several saloon owners nodded in agreement, their faces dark with displeasure. Aaron turned away from the threat, moving toward his cart. He helped each widow climb aboard, their movements stiff with shame. Hannah settled onto the wooden seat, her eyes downcast. Clara perched rigidly at the edge, while Ruth huddled close to Hannah's side. The cart's wheels creaked as Aaron guided it away from the auction yard. Townsfolk lined the street, staring in disbelief at the strange procession. An Amish man and three widows, rolling past the whitewashed church and weather-beaten storefronts. When they reached the edge of town, Aaron broke the heavy silence. "You won't be mocked again," he said firmly. "Not while I draw breath." Clara's bitter laugh cut through the morning air. "How can one plain man stand against a whole town?" She gestured back toward the cluster of buildings growing smaller behind them. "They want our spring water for their railroad. They'll never let us be." "The Lord provides strength where it's needed," Ruth whispered, though uncertainty wavered in her voice. Hannah remained silent, her hands twisted in her apron. The weight of coming gossip pressed down on all their shoulders. An Amish man buying three widows would set tongues wagging for months. The cart rattled along the rutted trail as the sun climbed higher. Ahead lay an abandoned line shack, its weathered boards barely visible through the scrub brush. Aaron guided the horses toward it, while the widows exchanged worried glances. "It ain't much," Clara muttered, "but it's better than being sold like cattle." "We'll make it right," Aaron assured them, his voice steady despite the dust coating his throat. "The Lord didn't bring us together without purpose." The cart creaked onward as shadows lengthened across the trail. Behind them, the town's steeple disappeared into the gathering dusk, but its threats lingered like storm clouds on the horizon. The widows huddled closer together, each lost in thoughts of what tomorrow might bring, and how one man's sacrifice could protect them from a town's worth of greed. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as the mule cart rattled along the rugged trail. Hannah, Clara, and Ruth watched their unlikely savior, studying his steady hands on the reins and the set of his shoulders beneath his plain black coat. "Might be a spell before we reach the place," Aaron said, his words unhurried and deliberate. The widows noticed his peculiar way of speaking, direct yet gentle, without the harsh edge they'd grown used to in town. Clara straightened her back against the wooden seat. "You always talk so careful-like." "Yeah," Aaron replied, with a slight nod. "The plain folk believe in measuring words like we measure grain." His response carried no offense, though an awkward silence followed. The sun climbed higher as they followed the winding path until a cluster of cottonwoods came into view. Nestled among them stood an abandoned line shack, its weathered boards silver-gray in the morning light. Despite its worn appearance, the structure looked solid, with its roof intact and walls standing straight. Aaron helped each woman down from the cart, then retrieved a lantern from his supplies. Inside, dust motes danced in the beam of light he cast around the single room. A pot-bellied stove squatted in one corner, while 3 bunks lined the far wall, their wooden frames sound but bare. Without a word, the widows began moving about the space, each finding purpose in the work before them. Hannah grabbed a rough broom from beside the door, attacking the layers of dust with determined strokes. Clara disappeared outside, returning minutes later with an armload of fallen cottonwood branches. Ruth's soft humming filled the air as she shook out and folded the few blankets they'd brought. Aaron watched them work, his head bowed slightly. "I thank you," he said quietly. "Your industry brings life to these walls already." As evening approached, Hannah managed to coax a meal from their meager supplies. They gathered around a small table, steam rising from bowls of beans and squares of cornbread. The food was simple, but the warmth of it eased some of the day's tension. "It was the cave-in," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. 3 months ago. My Thomas was working the deep shaft when it happened." Her voice was flat, as if pushing emotion away would make the words easier to bear. Hannah nodded, her spoon pausing halfway to her mouth. "My William, too. He always said that vein wasn't safe, but the foreman wouldn't listen." "John was trying to help them out," Ruth whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "He heard the timbers cracking and ran in to warn the others, but—" She couldn't finish. The silence grew thick around them, heavy with shared grief. Aaron looked at each woman in turn, his face full of compassion. "This home," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "can be a place of new beginnings if we choose. The Lord brings hope from darkness, like spring water from stone." Night crept in around the shack's edges, and coyotes began their lonesome chorus in the distance. The practical matter of sleeping arrangements couldn't be avoided any longer. The 3 bunks would house the widows, while Aaron made his bed on the floor near the stove, using his coat for a pillow. As they settled into their places, Ruth's clear voice rose in prayer. "Dear Lord, watch over us this night. Guide us in this strange arrangement and help us trust in your wisdom even when the path seems uncertain." The others murmured, "Amen," their voices blending in the darkness. Outside, moonlight spilled across the landscape, touching the spring that bubbled up through rocks nearby. The silver light caught the water's movement, a quiet promise of life continuing despite all changes. Inside the shack, the widows lay in their bunks, each lost in private thoughts. The steady sound of Aaron's breathing from his place on the floor was both comforting and strange. A man's presence in their household again, yet so different from what they'd known before. Trust would take time to build, like a house raised one beam at a time. But tonight they had shelter, safety, and the first fragile threads of understanding between them. The first rays of sunrise painted the eastern sky in gentle hues of pink and gold. Aaron rose early, gathering salvaged boards he'd spotted behind the shack. The worn wooden planks might not be perfect, but they would serve to patch the leaky roof. He climbed the crude ladder with careful steps, his plain black hat set aside for the work ahead. The steady rhythm of his hammering echoed across the quiet morning. Hannah emerged from the shack, carrying a rusty pail filled with nails she'd found in a corner. She studied the roof, then gathered her skirts and climbed up to join him, her movements cautious but determined. "I can hold the board steady," she offered, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the rough wood. Aaron nodded, accepting her help without comment. Together they worked in comfortable silence, the sound of hammering punctuated only by the occasional murmur of instruction. Below, Clara attacked a pile of fallen branches with an old axe, her powerful swing splitting the wood with surprising force. The rhythmic thunk of the blade matched Aaron's hammering, creating an oddly peaceful melody of productive work. Her face showed fierce concentration as she reduced the branches to neat piles of kindling. Inside the shack, Ruth moved about the kitchen space with quiet efficiency. She had cleaned the old stove until it gleamed, and now the smell of rising bread dough filled the air. Her hands worked the dough with practiced motions, kneading life back into the simple ingredients. As evening approached, transformation settled over the shack like a warm blanket. Smoke curled from the chimney, in gentle wisps, carrying the promise of warmth within. The aroma of baking bread wafted through the repaired roof, drawing everyone inside as the day's work concluded. Hannah wiped dust from her hands and took in their accomplishments. The roof no longer showed patches of sky through its boards. The stack of kindling stood neat and ready by the door. The stove radiated welcome heat, and Ruth's bread waited golden brown on the table. Clara reached for a piece of warm bread and suddenly let out a small laugh at its perfect crust. Hannah joined in, and then Ruth, the sound of their shared mirth filling the shack with unexpected joy. They caught themselves, almost surprised by the forgotten sensation of happiness. "I haven't laughed like that since—" Hannah's voice trailed off, but her smile remained. "Since before," Clara finished for her, understanding in her eyes. Aaron looked up from where he sat mending a chair leg. "Each of you carries strength the world mocks, but I see as gift," he said softly. "The Lord's power shows clear in hands that know honest work." Ruth reached for the worn Bible she'd brought with her, opening it by lamplight. Her voice grew steady and clear as she read, "The stone which the builders rejected, the same is become the head." The words hung in the air like a blessing. The widows exchanged glances, each feeling the scripture's touch on their hearts. They had been rejected, cast aside by their community. Yet here they sat, building something new from the broken pieces of their lives. The first drops of rain began to fall outside, pattering against the newly repaired roof. They gathered closer to the stove's warmth, listening to the sound of water striking solid boards above. No leaks appeared to mar the comfort of their shelter. "We'll need supplies soon," Aaron said, his voice thoughtful. "I'll walk with you into town when you're ready." The women stiffened slightly, remembering the jeers and mockery they'd faced before. Clara's jaw set in a hard line, while Hannah twisted her apron in worried hands. "The townsfolk," Ruth began hesitantly, but Aaron shook his head. "Dignity is worth walking in daylight," he said firmly. "We'll go together, heads high." The rain continued its gentle song on the roof as they prepared for sleep. The day's labor had brought more than physical changes to their shelter. Something else had been mended, too. A sense of purpose, of worth, that had been buried beneath months of grief and shame. They had worked side by side, each contributing what they could, and found themselves stronger together than apart. Ruth's nightly prayer seemed to embrace them all like a warm shawl, her words mixing with the peaceful sound of rainfall. In their bunks, the widows felt the first stirrings of hope, built from hammer blows, axe swings, and bread dough kneaded by determined hands. Morning sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods as Aaron hitched the mule to their cart. The widows stood near the shack's door, straightening their worn dresses and shawls with nervous hands. The trip to town loomed before them like a mountain to climb. "Best we get moving," Aaron said softly, helping each woman onto the wooden bench. The cart creaked as they settled, Hannah smoothing her skirts while Clara gripped the side rail. Ruth clutched a small list of needed supplies, written in careful script. The mule plodded forward, its steady hoofbeats marking time as they followed the rutted trail toward town. As buildings came into view, the widows drew closer together on the bench. Aaron kept his eyes forward, his posture straight and calm despite the tension in the air. Townsfolk stopped their morning routines to stare as the unusual group passed. Women on porches whispered behind raised hands. Men outside the saloon sneered, making no effort to hide their contempt. A child pointed until his mother yanked his arm down. "Look at them fat ones," someone muttered just loud enough to hear. "Riding around like proper ladies now." Hannah's cheeks flushed red, but Aaron's quiet voice steadied them. "Pay no mind. We're here for honest business, nothing more." They stopped in front of the general store. Aaron helped each woman down, then walked beside them to the door. The bell jingled as they entered, drawing the storekeeper's suspicious gaze from behind his counter. Ruth stepped forward with her list, but the man hesitated, looking past her to Aaron. "These women got credit for goods?" "They have coin," Aaron replied evenly, placing several pieces on the counter. "We need flour, beans, and seed for planting." The storekeeper's fingers slowly drew the money closer. He nodded reluctantly and began gathering their supplies, though his movements showed clear reluctance to serve them. While Clara and Ruth collected the items, Hannah lingered near bins of seed packets, touching them tentatively. Her eyes held visions of green shoots pushing through dark soil. Aaron noticed her interest and added extra packets to their purchase. They had just stepped back onto the boardwalk, arms full of supplies, when Sheriff Dobbs blocked their path. His badge caught the morning light as he hooked his thumbs in his gun belt. "Thought I made myself clear before," he drawled, eyes hard despite his casual tone. "That spring don't belong to you anymore. Folks higher up have eyes on it." "The deed is proper and true," Aaron replied calmly. "God's law values honesty over greed, Sheriff." "God's law don't mean much to railroad men," Dobbs shot back. "Best remember that." The ride home was heavy with worry. Clara broke the tense silence first. "Maybe we should leave," she said. "Find somewhere folk don't know us." "Where would we go?" Hannah asked softly. Everything we have is here. We could try another town, Ruth suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Aaron listened to their fears before speaking. If you leave, the land is lost forever, he said firmly. If you stay, you have me beside you. The women fell quiet, considering his words as the cart swayed homeward. The sun was setting by the time they reached the shack, painting the spring's surface with golden light. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they gathered around the lamp's warm glow. The day's tension slowly eased as they spoke of small hopes for their shared home. Hannah smoothed her apron, eyes bright. I could plant a garden near the spring, she said. Fresh vegetables would be such a blessing. I found some quilting scraps in the store, Clara added, pulling colored fabric from her pocket. Been years since I had time to sew proper. Ruth's voice grew soft with longing. Someday, maybe we'll hear children laughing around this table again, reading lessons and Bible verses, like when I was young. Aaron sat in his corner chair, listening to their dreams while mending a harness strap. These simple hopes stirred memories of family life long denied him by his solitary wandering. The women's voices filled the shack with warmth he'd almost forgotten could exist. Outside in the gathering dark, coyotes began their nightly chorus. The wild sounds echoed across the hills, carrying notes of warning that seemed to circle their small island of lamplight. Ruth reached for her Bible, ready for evening prayers, while Hannah banked the stove fire. Clara's fingers moved steadily, piecing together bright scraps of fabric. In that moment of peaceful industry, they all felt the first tender roots of belonging taking hold, despite the threats that lurked beyond their door. Dawn painted the sky in gentle rose as Aaron hitched the mule to their cart. The widows emerged from the shack wearing their best dresses, faded but carefully pressed. Hannah had pinned her hair neatly beneath her bonnet, while Clara straightened Ruth's collar with motherly care. The Lord sees past earthly judgment, Aaron reminded them quietly, as he helped each woman onto the wooden bench. Their small cart joined the procession of wagons and riders, heading toward the white clapboard church that stood sentinel at the edge of town. The building's weathered sides glowed in the morning light, its bell tower reaching skyward like a finger pointing to heaven. As Aaron secured the mule, the widows hesitated at the bottom of the church steps. Other churchgoers flowed past them, some averting their eyes while others stared openly. Hold your heads high, Aaron murmured, taking his place beside them. They entered together, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The usual soft murmur of pre-service greetings died away as heads turned to watch them find seats in an empty pew near the back. Hannah folded her hands tightly in her lap, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon them. Clara sat rigidly, her jaw set against the whispers that rippled through the congregation. Ruth drew her Bible close to her chest like a shield. The circuit preacher, Reverend Matthews, mounted the pulpit as the last hymn faded. His sermon began with familiar words about righteousness and proper conduct, but midway through he paused, his gaze fixed directly on their pew. Brother Zook, he called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed church. Scripture forbids scandal. You cannot house 3 widows without lawful vows. Gasps spread through the congregation, like wind through dry grass. The widows lowered their eyes, their faces burning with fresh shame. Hannah's shoulders trembled slightly, while Clara's fingers gripped the pew before her until her knuckles whitened. Aaron rose slowly, his plain black coat a stark contrast to the colorful Sunday best around them. His voice came steady and clear. These women are not scandal. They are my family in Christ. The words hung in the air like morning mist. Some congregants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others whispered furiously behind raised hands. The preacher's face reddened, but before he could respond, Aaron remained standing, his presence a quiet challenge to anyone who would shame these women further. The remainder of the service passed in a blur of uncomfortable hymns and shortened prayers. As the congregation filed out into the Sunday morning sunshine, a group of townsmen blocked their path to the cart. "He's building himself a harem," one man spat, his face twisted with disgust. Others nodded in agreement, emboldened by his cruel words. Aaron stepped forward, physically placing himself between the widows and the hostile crowd. Without a word, he guided the women through the press of bodies, his arm steady as he helped them into the cart. The mules' hooves kicked up dust as they left the churchyard behind, the sound of malicious murmurs fading with each step homeward. Back at the shack, the weight of the morning settled heavily upon them. Ruth sank into a chair, tears sliding down her cheeks. "We've brought you only ruin," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Your good name is spoiled because of us." Aaron knelt beside her chair, his weathered hands clasping hers gently. "Ridicule cannot measure your worth," he said firmly, looking at each woman in turn. "The world sees what it wishes to see, but God knows the truth in our hearts." The afternoon light dimmed toward evening, lengthening shadows across the floorboards. Clara moved quietly to light the lantern, its warm glow pushing back the gathering dark. Hannah began setting out their simple supper, though none felt much appetite for food. They ate in silence, each lost in thought about the morning's events. The only sounds were the clink of spoons against bowls and the distant call of evening birds. Yet there was comfort in their shared meal, in the simple act of breaking bread together despite the world's judgment. As they prepared for sleep, Aaron's voice cut through the heavy quiet. "We will walk upright," he promised, his tone carrying the same steady conviction that had faced down the preacher. "Truth will outlast mockery." The widows looked at him, drawing strength from his unwavering faith in their small family. Though the day had brought fresh wounds, they found solace in knowing they faced it together, bound by something stronger than the town's cruel words. Morning light spilled across the yard as Aaron and Clara gathered stones from the creek bed. Their shoulders strained as they carried each heavy rock to shore up the crumbling well walls. The old mortar had weakened over years of neglect, but Aaron's steady hands carefully fitted each stone into place. "This one here," Clara said, pointing to a flat stone. "It'll sit proper against that corner." Her experience as a blacksmith's daughter showed in how she assessed each rock's strength. Near the shack's weathered walls, Hannah worked the soil with quiet determination. Her strong arms turned over the earth, making neat rows for early bean plants. She pressed each seed into the dark soil with care, whispering a small prayer for growth. Ruth moved between the spring and the garden, her bucket sloshing as she carried water to Hannah's newly planted seeds. The hem of her dress grew damp, but she didn't mind. There was peace in the rhythm of their shared work. Aaron paused in his stone laying, noticing something different about the spring's flow. He set down his tools and walked to the water's edge, kneeling to observe more closely. "Come see," he called softly to the others. "The water runs clearer than before." The widows gathered around him, watching as the spring bubbled up with renewed strength. The water sparkled in the morning light, pure and sweet. "A gift from above," Aaron said, removing his hat. "Let us give thanks." They joined hands in a circle around the spring. Ruth's clear voice led them in prayer, thanking God for this blessing of clean water. Hannah wiped tears from her eyes as they finished, touched by the simple ceremony. The sun had climbed to midday when movement at the edge of their property caught Clara's attention. A Ute family approached hesitantly, a father, mother, and 3 small children. They carried empty water vessels, their faces showing both hope and uncertainty. The father spoke softly in careful English. "Our wells run dry. Might we have water?" Aaron stepped forward, his welcome genuine. "The spring is God's gift to all his children," he said, gesturing toward the flowing water. "Please, take what you need." Hannah disappeared into the shack, emerging moments later with a plate of fresh cornbread. She offered it to the mother with a warm smile that needed no translation. At first, an awkward silence hung in the air as the family filled their vessels. Then one of the children said something that made his mother laugh, and Hannah joined in, though she didn't understand the words. Soon, other children's giggles joined the chorus. The afternoon mellowed into something unexpected and precious. The Ute children chased each other through the yard, their happy shouts mixing with the spring's gentle burble. Ruth sat on the shack's steps, singing Amazing Grace while she mended a shirt. The mother showed Hannah how she wove her baskets, while Clara and the father compared notes on building techniques through gesture and broken phrases. Aaron watched it all from near the well, his heart full. Here was something he'd never thought to see, his odd family growing larger, stronger, richer in spirit with each passing hour. The widows moved with new purpose, their shoulders straight and proud. Gone was the shame of being seen as burdens. Instead, they had become providers, offering water and welcome to neighbors in need. As the sun began to sink, the Ute family gathered their filled vessels. The mother pressed a small woven basket into Hannah's hands in thanks. The children waved goodbye, their smiles bright in the golden evening light. After they'd gone, Aaron gathered the widows near the spring. "This is what the land was meant for," he said softly. "Life shared." That evening they sat around their table, now graced with fresh cornbread and early spring greens. Hannah had arranged wildflowers in the new basket, adding beauty to their simple meal. Clara's laugh rang out at something Ruth said, a sound so free and joyful it startled them all into silence before they joined in. Looking at their faces in the lamp's warm glow, Aaron saw something he hadn't noticed before. The widows were smiling, truly smiling, as if years of grief had finally begun to lift. Their eyes shone with renewed purpose, reflecting the light of not just the lamp, but of hope restored. Ruth reached for Hannah's hand, and Clara's fingers soon joined theirs. "Thank you, Lord," Ruth whispered, "for bringing us home." The spring's gentle music drifted through the open window, a constant reminder of God's provision and the simple joy of serving others. Together, they had transformed a place of exile into a sanctuary of welcome, where dignity grew as surely as Hannah's newly planted beans. The days settled into gentle rhythm at the line shack. Morning light would find Hannah at the wooden table, flour dusting her arms as she worked dough with practiced hands. Aaron watched her careful movements, noting how she folded and kneaded with purpose. "Here," Hannah said one morning, guiding his hands through the motions. "When you stretch it just so, one measure of flour becomes enough for 2 loaves. Her fingers were warm against his as she demonstrated the technique. Aaron marveled at her knowledge. "You make it seem like magic," he said softly. Hannah's cheeks colored at the praise. "Not magic, just years of feeding hungry miners with too little to spare." In the afternoons, Clara would spread her quilting pieces across the table, explaining the patterns to Aaron. "This one's called Jacob's Ladder," she said, arranging dark and light squares. "See how the strips make steps reaching heavenward?" Aaron traced the pattern with weathered fingers. "Like our own climb toward grace," he observed, making Clara smile. Ruth's voice filled their evenings with scripture and song. Her quiet strength showed in how she chose passages that spoke to their situation. Verses about strangers becoming family, about faith overcoming fear. The lamplight caught the silver threading through her dark hair as she read, lending her words extra weight. Their shared laughter came easier now, bubbling up at small moments. A story about Hannah's first attempts at baking, Clara's tale of chasing off a curious bear, Ruth's gentle jokes about Aaron's careful way of doing everything. The sound of their mirth drifted through the cabin like music. One evening, after Hannah had served up a particularly satisfying stew, they lingered at the table, reluctant to break the warm fellowship. Clara looked around at their faces, touched by how natural it all felt. "Perhaps," she said slowly, measuring her words, "we are not 3 widows anymore, but one family." Her voice carried hope and uncertainty in equal measure. The words settled over them like a comfortable quilt. Hannah reached for Clara's hand, while Ruth's eyes grew bright with tears. But Aaron felt the weight of the circuit preacher's warnings press against his heart. He excused himself early, stepping out into the cool night air. Under the stars, he dropped to his knees. "Lord," he prayed, his voice barely a whisper, "guide me to do what's right, not what's easy." The night offered no immediate answer, but the peace of honest prayer eased his troubled mind. The next afternoon, while Aaron repaired fence posts, Ruth was sorting through an old trunk filled with papers and mementos from their husbands. Her sudden gasp brought everyone running. "Look," she exclaimed, holding up a weathered document with trembling hands. "The original deed to the spring and surrounding land, filed by our husbands before the cave-in." Clara snatched the paper, her eyes racing across the legal writing. "It's true. Everything signed and proper, filed with the territory office." Hannah pressed her hands to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "The Lord has protected us all along," she whispered. They gathered around the precious document, hope rising in their hearts like morning sun breaking through clouds. But Aaron studied their bright faces with concern. "This paper proves you're right," he said carefully, "but it will anger men who thirst for control. The sheriff, the traders, they won't welcome this truth." Clara's jaw set stubbornly. "Let them be angry. The law is on our side now." Ruth placed the deed carefully on the table. "Perhaps God kept it hidden until we were strong enough to stand together." That evening, they sat around the table as usual, but everything felt different. The lamp cast their mingled shadows on the wall. 4 shapes merged into one family picture. Hannah served fresh bread, Clara spread her latest quilt piece nearby, and Ruth held the deed like a shield against the darkness. Outside, an owl called into the gathering night, its cry sharp and warning. But inside their small home, the warmth of belonging pushed back against the darkness. They were no longer just 3 widows and a wandering Amish man. They had become something new, something stronger. Aaron looked at each face in turn, Hannah's gentle strength, Clara's fierce determination, Ruth's quiet faith. The preacher's warnings still whispered in his mind, but now they competed with a deeper truth. God's family grew in unexpected ways, defying the world's narrow rules with love's broader wisdom. The deed lay between them on the table, its presence both promise and challenge. Their future remained uncertain, but they would face it together, bound by more than paper and ink, bound by the choice to become family. Dawn painted the Colorado sky in soft pink when Clara began stringing her quilts across the yard. The colorful squares danced in the morning breeze, transforming the weathered shack into something almost magical. Stars and compasses, Jacob's ladders and flying geese patterns brought life to the dusty landscape. Hannah stood in the doorway, breathing in the morning air mixed with the scent of baking bread. She'd risen before first light to get the dough rising, knowing nearby settlers often passed by their spring. "Might as well give them something worth stopping for," she'd said, kneading with purpose. Ruth's clear voice lifted in hymn practice, floating out across the yard. She'd chosen songs of thanksgiving, her confidence growing stronger with each passing day. The melody wrapped around them like a warm embrace as they went about their morning tasks. Aaron paused in his work, watching the women move with such ease now. Gone were the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of those first difficult days. In their place stood 3 women who knew their worth. The sight brought a smile to his weathered face. "The deed should settle everything," Clara said, adjusting a quilt corner. "Once the town clerk sees the paper, they'll have to accept our claim." Hannah nodded, pulling fresh loaves from the oven. "We'll take it in tomorrow. Show them proper and legal-like." As evening approached, the Ute family arrived, their children running ahead to greet Ruth. The father carried a wrapped bundle of venison, offering it with a gentle nod. "For the water," he said simply, "for welcome." Hannah quickly set about preparing the meat while Clara spread quilts on the ground. Soon the smell of cooking filled the air, drawing everyone into a circle. Ruth taught the Ute children a simple hymn, their young voices blending with hers in the gathering dusk. Aaron built a small fire, its flames casting warm light on smiling faces. The widows glowed with pride as they served their guests, no longer outcasts but hosts with something precious to share. Laughter bubbled up freely, bridging any gaps of language or custom. The Ute mother admired Clara's quilts, running gentle fingers over the stitching. Through gestures and broken English, they shared stories of their craft work. Hannah offered extra bread, which was accepted with grateful smiles. Children chased fireflies while adults nodded over shared cups of coffee. But just as the guests were preparing to leave, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. 2 riders materialized from the darkness, their faces ugly with purpose. The Ute family melted silently into the shadows as the thugs dismounted. "Well, ain't this cozy?" the first man sneered, kicking dirt toward the fire. "Regular church social, looks like." The second man moved closer, his eyes fixed on Aaron. "Railroad sent us with a message. That spring won't stay yours long." Hannah clutched the deed to her chest, while Clara stepped forward, chin raised. Ruth moved to stand between the men and the children still hiding in the shadows. "We have legal right to this land," Aaron said calmly, though his hands clenched at his sides. The first man spat. "Legal don't mean much out here." He shoved Aaron hard, making him stumble. "Better watch yourself, Amish. Men have hung for stealing women." "He stole nothing," Clara's voice cracked like a whip. "We chose to stay." The second man laughed, an ugly sound. "Chose? 3 fat widows with nowhere else to go?" He turned to Aaron. "Railroad's backing us now. This is your only warning." They mounted up, wheeling their horses too close to the quilts still hanging. "Sleep light," the first man called as they rode away. "Never know what might catch fire in the night." Silence fell heavy as a burial shroud. The fire crackled, throwing strange shadows. From somewhere in the darkness, an owl called once, a mournful sound. Aaron exhaled slowly, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "We will not bow to fear." The widows drew together, Hannah still clutching the deed, Clara's eyes bright with anger, Ruth whispering prayers. They had stood their ground together, and despite their trembling, pride straightened their spines. Aaron moved methodically around the yard, checking the shack's walls and windows. He double-barred the door, its heavy thunk echoing in the quiet room. The widows huddled near the stove, making plans in low voices. Outside, crickets sang their evening song as if nothing had changed. But inside the shack, everything had shifted. The joy of their gathering had been poisoned by threats, yet somehow their shared defiance had bound them even closer together. The midnight silence shattered as pounding hooves echoed through the darkness. Ruth jolted awake first, her breath catching at the sound of breaking glass. Then came the horrifying crackle of flames. "Fire!" she screamed, shaking the others awake. "The roof!" Orange flames leaped across the shingles Aaron had so carefully repaired. The dry wood caught quickly, sending sparks dancing against the star-filled sky. Heat pressed down as smoke began seeping through the ceiling boards. Aaron burst into action, grabbing a heavy wool blanket from his bed. "Get out!" he shouted, pushing the women toward the door. He rushed outside, beating at the flames with desperate swings of the blanket. Each impact sent sparks showering around him. Clara ran to the spring, her nightdress billowing. She hauled bucket after bucket, passing them up to Aaron, who stood precariously on the ladder. The water sizzled against the burning roof, releasing clouds of steam into the night air. Hannah fought her way through the thickening smoke to the lean-to where their mule stomped in panic. She grabbed his halter, speaking low and steady despite her terror. "Easy now, easy." She led him to safety, then ran back to help Ruth. Ruth darted in and out of the shack, dragging out what she could save. She clutched their precious Bible, Clara's remaining quilts, and Hannah's cooking pots. But the flames moved faster than human hands could work. A terrible cracking sound split the air. "The roof!" Clara screamed. "Aaron, get down!" Aaron barely jumped clear as a section of the roof collapsed inward, sending up a fountain of sparks. The stored food, the carefully mended furniture, the humble comforts they had built together, all vanished into the inferno. They fought on, passing buckets and beating at flames until their arms shook with exhaustion. But gradually the fire died down, leaving them standing in smoky ruin. The widows huddled together, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on their faces. Hannah touched a charred quilt square, her voice breaking. "All our work, just as it was becoming home." The crunch of approaching horses made them turn. Torchlight bobbed through the darkness as Sheriff Dobbs and his deputies rode up, their faces hard in the flickering light. "Well, well," the sheriff drawled, swinging down from his saddle. "Quite a commotion out here tonight." "Our home was attacked," Clara said fiercely, "while you did nothing to stop it." The sheriff ignored her, focusing on Aaron. "Aaron Zook, you're under arrest." "What?" Ruth stepped forward. "He's done nothing wrong." "Bigamy and unlawful cohabitation," Sheriff Dobbs sneered, unfurling a warrant. "Living in sin with 3 women, that's against the law." "That's a lie," Hannah's voice shook with rage. "He saved us, protected us." "The law's the law." The sheriff nodded to his deputies, who moved to flank Aaron. "Come quiet now, or we'll add resisting arrest." Aaron stood straight despite his exhaustion, soot streaking his plain clothes. "I will come peacefully," he said, his voice carrying quiet strength. He turned to the widows, who reached for him with desperate hands. "You cannot take him," Clara tried to push between the deputies. "We need him!" Aaron caught her hands gently. "Be still," he said. "God's truth does not burn. Hold to that." The deputies bound his hands, shoving him toward a waiting horse. The widows clung to each other, watching helplessly as Aaron was led away. Torchlight caught his face as he looked back once, peace somehow still evident in his expression. Sheriff Dobbs lingered, studying the devastation with satisfaction. "Best start packing what's left," he said. "This land won't be yours much longer." He wheeled his horse and rode after his men, leaving the women alone in the smoking ruins of their home. Ruth sank to her knees, her prayers mixing with sobs. Clara stood rigid, fists clenched as she watched the torches disappear into darkness. Hannah wrapped her arms around them both, her own tears falling freely. Around them, the night pressed close. Smoke still rose from the blackened timbers of their shack. The spring burbled quietly, its sound now a mockery of their earlier joy. Their few salvaged possessions lay scattered in the yard, and the smell of burning hung heavy in the air. The widows huddled closer, their shoulders touching as they waited for dawn. Each woman prayed silently, clinging to Aaron's last words. God's truth does not burn. They would need that truth to face whatever morning might bring. The mule whickered softly from his place of safety, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed their own desolation. Together they watched the stars wheel overhead, counting the endless minutes until daylight. The sun crept over the eastern hills, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of amber and rose. The three widows stood before their ruined home, shoulders touching as they surveyed the destruction. Wisps of smoke still curled upward from the blackened timbers, while meadowlarks sang their morning songs, indifferent to human suffering. Clara moved first, her practical nature asserting itself through grief. She began sorting through the charred boards, testing each one for soundness. "Some of these might still be useful," she said, her voice rough from smoke. "We'll need them, whatever comes next." Hannah knelt in what remained of her garden, carefully sifting through the scorched earth with trembling fingers. "Look here," she whispered, holding up a handful of unburned seeds she'd stored in a buried jar. "Not everything's lost." Ruth stood apart, clutching their precious deed against her chest. The paper had survived only because she'd taken to sleeping with it beneath her pillow. "We are not done," she insisted, her quiet voice carrying steel. "Not while we have this truth in our hands." They worked quickly, salvaging what little remained. Clara hitched their faithful mule to the cart, while Hannah gathered the few belongings they'd managed to save. Within an hour, they were ready. "To town, then?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Ruth nodded firmly. "To Aaron." They climbed onto the cart, their faces still streaked with soot, their clothes smelling of smoke. The mule plodded forward, heading down the familiar trail toward town. None of them spoke of their fear, but each woman's spine was straight with determination. At the jailhouse, they found Aaron sitting peacefully in his cell, his voice carrying clearly as he recited from memory. "Though an host should encamp against me, my heart shall not fear." Sheriff Dobbs lounged at his desk, boots propped up, a mocking smile playing at his lips. "Well, if it ain't the Three Sisters of Mercy, come to visit their protector." Clara stepped forward, her voice steady despite her rage. "He did not sin. He saved us from shame when no one else would lift a finger." "He's living in sin with 3 women," the sheriff drawled. "That's against the law." "The only sin," Hannah declared, "is how this town treated 3 widows who'd lost everything." Ruth's softer voice added, "We demand a hearing before Judge McBride." The sheriff's boots hit the floor with a thud. He studied them, perhaps seeing for the first time that these women would not be easily cowed. "Judge comes tomorrow morning, but don't expect any favors." Outside the jailhouse, townsfolk gathered, some pointing and whispering, others openly jeering. But there were a few who looked troubled, who seemed to question what they'd been told about Aaron and the widows. "Where will you stay tonight?" Aaron called from his cell, concern evident in his voice. "We'll manage," Clara answered firmly, though they all knew their options were few. As darkness fell, they parked their cart in a quiet corner of the livery stable. The owner, perhaps moved by pity, didn't charge them for the space. They huddled together in the cart bed, sharing a thin blanket against the cooling air. Ruth pulled out their Bible, its pages warped from the heat of the fire, but still readable. By lantern light, she read words of comfort. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Hannah pressed close, drawing warmth from her sisters in hardship. "Do you remember," she whispered, "how they laughed at us in the auction yard? How they thought we were nothing?" Clara's voice came strong through the darkness. "They wanted to bury us in shame, but we're still standing." The other two nodded, drawing courage from her words. Around them, the town settled into night. The livery horses shuffled in their stalls, and somewhere a dog barked at the rising moon. Despite their hunger and discomfort, the widows felt a fierce pride. They had lost nearly everything, but they had not lost their dignity or their faith. Ruth tucked the deed safely away and extinguished the lantern. In the darkness, 3 women who had once been strangers clasped hands, their breathing falling into rhythm as they drifted toward sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but tonight they had each other, and that was no small thing. The night settled into silence, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the occasional hoot of an owl. The widows slept fitfully, but they slept as one family, ready to face whatever the morning might bring. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the packed wooden benches. Every seat was filled, with townsfolk standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The air hung heavy with whispers and the rustle of cotton dresses and wool coats. Judge Thomas McBride sat at his elevated desk, his weathered face bearing the tired look of a man who had seen too much injustice during the war. His silver hair caught the light as he adjusted his reading glasses, studying the assembly before him. Sheriff Dobbs strutted forward, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Your Honor, we got ourselves a clear case of moral corruption. This here Amish man," he gestured toward Aaron, who stood quietly between 2 deputies, "has been living in sin with 3 women, making a mockery of decent folk." The traitor, Marcus Whitfield, stepped forward next, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. "And there's more, Judge. That spring they claim? Railroads had rights to it for months." He flourished a piece of paper, its ink suspiciously fresh. "Got the deed right here, signed and proper." Gasps rippled through the courthouse. Hannah gripped Clara's hand, while Ruth sat straight-backed, her face calm despite the storm building inside her. Then Ruth stood, her movement drawing all eyes. In her hands, she held a different paper, its edges worn, but its text clear. "If it pleases the court," she said, her voice steady and clear as a church bell, "I hold the true deed, signed by our husbands before witnesses 5 years ago. Truth does not vanish with time or tragedy." Judge McBride beckoned for both documents. He examined them carefully, his frown deepening as he compared the signatures and dates. The courthouse fell silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock. "Sheriff Dobbs," the judge said finally, "these charges of impropriety, what proof do you have beyond town gossip?" The sheriff shuffled his feet. "Well, Judge, everyone knows—" "I did not ask what everyone knows," McBride cut in sharply. "I asked for proof." Turning to Aaron, the judge's voice softened slightly. "Mr. Zook, you have risked much. Your freedom, your reputation, even your standing with your own people. Tell this court why." Aaron stood, his plain black coat dusty from the jail cell, but his dignity intact. "Your Honor, years ago I was caught in a blizzard, near death from cold and hunger. These 3 women took me in. They shared their food when they had little. They tended my frost-bitten hands. They sang hymns through the night to keep my spirit from failing." He paused, looking at each of the widows in turn. "Their mercy is greater law than greed. I owed them a life debt, and I aim to repay it honorably." Clara rose next, her voice strong with long-held pain. "We lost our husbands in the mine collapse. The town that once welcomed us turned cruel. We were mocked, treated like cattle to be sold." Hannah joined her, tears streaming freely down her face. "Aaron gave us back our dignity. He works beside us, treats us like family. There is no sin in that, only Christian charity." The crowd stirred uneasily. Several townspeople lowered their heads, shame finally touching hearts that had been hard with judgment. Judge McBride removed his glasses, wiping them slowly with a handkerchief. His eyes, when he looked up, were bright with moisture. "I have seen enough. This deed," he held up the trader's paper, "is clearly forged, the ink barely dry. But this," he lifted the miner's deed, "bears the proper seals and witnesses. The spring belongs to these widows, by law and right." He lifted his gavel. "Furthermore, I find no evidence of impropriety against Mr. Zook. His actions, though unusual, speak to the highest Christian virtues of mercy and protection of the vulnerable. All charges are dismissed." The gavel cracked like thunder against the desk. Sheriff Dobbs slunk toward the door, his face dark with thwarted plans. The trader followed, muttering threats under his breath. But their voices were drowned out by sudden cheers as Aaron's handcuffs were removed. The widows rushed forward, throwing their arms around Aaron. Ruth wept openly, while Clara laughed through her tears. Hannah simply held on tight, as if afraid he might disappear. "Thank you," Aaron whispered to them all. "Your courage made this possible." Around them, townsfolk pressed close, offering handshakes and apologies. The morning sun streamed brighter now through the courthouse windows, touching their faces with golden light as they stood together. Family forged in hardship and victory, strength renewed by justice served. That evening, a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine through the valley as townsfolk gathered at the burned-out shack. One by one, they approached with downcast eyes and soft words of regret. "We were wrong to judge," Mrs. Peterson whispered, pressing a basket of fresh eggs into Hannah's hands. "Please forgive us." Mr. Thompson, the lumber merchant, cleared his throat. "I brought some good pine boards, least I could do." He gestured to his wagon, piled high with fresh-cut lumber. The preacher stepped forward, his hat held against his chest. "Brother Zook, sisters, I spoke harsh words without understanding. The Lord has shown me my error." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "If you'll permit, I'd like to help rebuild." Aaron nodded, extending his hand. God's grace makes all things new. As the sun arced westward, the sound of hammering filled the air. Neighbors formed a line, passing boards up to where Aaron and Clara worked on the roof. Hannah stirred a pot of bean soup large enough to feed everyone, while Ruth organized the volunteers. Children darted between the adults, carrying nails and tools. The new roof took shape, stronger than before. Fresh boards replaced the charred walls, and windows were set with care. As dusk approached, the transformation was remarkable, not just of the building, but of hearts. Around the evening fire, Aaron gathered the widows close. His voice was gentle but clear. "These past weeks have shown me God's purpose. A family needs proper naming." He turned to Hannah, whose eyes widened. "Hannah, you've shown me the meaning of grace through your kindness. Will you join me in covenant marriage?" Tears spilled down Hannah's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, "with all my heart." Clara and Ruth embraced them both, their joy evident. "We'll stay as sisters," Clara declared firmly. This home has room enough for all. Ruth squeezed Hannah's hand. God has made us a true family. 3 days later, wildflowers decorated the yard as neighbors gathered again, this time in celebration. Children scattered petals along a path to where the preacher stood. Aaron waited there in his best black coat, his face serene. Hannah walked toward him, wearing a simple blue dress that Clara had sewn. A crown of daisies graced her hair, Ruth's handiwork. The spring burbled nearby, its clear water catching the sunlight. The preacher's words rang with sincerity as he joined their hands. What God has brought together, let no man put asunder. After the simple ceremony, tables groaned with food brought by neighbors. Quilts spread on the grass became spots for families to gather. Laughter mixed with hymns as the community celebrated together. Clara and Ruth moved among the guests, no longer outcasts but respected members of the household. Their faces glowed with quiet joy, secure in their place as sisters of the heart. As evening approached, the gathered neighbors joined in singing Amazing Grace, their voices rising clear and strong against the mountain peaks. The spring flowed steadily, a testament to renewal, while the rebuilt home stood as a symbol of restored dignity and hope. The twilight painted the Colorado sky in deep purples and golds as lamplight spilled from the windows of the transformed homestead. Where a shabby line shack once stood, a sturdy home now rose against the darkening horizon. Fresh-cut boards gleamed in the fading light, and smoke curled from the stone chimney into the evening air. Inside, Hannah moved with quiet grace around a long table laden with the bounty of their labor. Steam rose from an iron pot of rabbit stew, while loaves of fresh bread filled the room with their homey scent. Bowls of sun-ripened berries and early apples from their young garden added splashes of color to the feast. Clara arranged wooden plates and spoons with care, pausing to adjust a bright quilt that hung on the wall, one of many she had crafted to make the house a home. Ruth hummed softly as she placed wildflowers in tin cans along the windowsills, their sweet fragrance mixing with the aroma of cooking. The sound of wagon wheels and voices drew them to the door. Ute families approached on foot and horseback, women carrying woven baskets filled with dried meat and wild herbs. Behind them came settler families in wagons, their children bouncing eagerly in the back, clutching jars of preserves and wheels of cheese. "Welcome, friends," Aaron called from the doorway, his plain black coat and beard a stark contrast to his warm smile. "God's peace be with you all." The room soon filled with the musical sound of different languages mingling, English, Pennsylvania Dutch, and Ute, as neighbors settled around the long table. Children darted between adults' legs, their laughter bright and uninhibited. In a corner, Clara gently rocked a small bundle, a 3-month-old baby boy whose mother had died in childbirth. The sheriff had brought him to their door last week, knowing the homestead had become a haven for those in need. The infant's tiny fingers curled around Clara's thumb as she hummed a lullaby. When all were seated, Aaron rose, his voice steady and clear in the lamplight. "Friends, we gather to give thanks. What the world once scorned, God has raised up. This table, once empty, now overflows. These walls, once burned, now shelter all who come in peace." He paused, meeting Hannah's eyes across the table. "Where there was mockery, now there is joy." Hannah's face glowed with contentment as she gazed at her husband. The gold band on her finger caught the lamplight, a simple circle that represented such profound change. No longer was she the useless widow of town gossip, but a woman of strength and dignity, sharing the abundance of their home. Ruth's clear voice lifted in song, starting one of the hymns that had sustained them through dark times. Others joined in, the harmony swelling until it seemed to make the lamplight dance. The baby stirred in Clara's arms, but didn't wake, soothed by the music and motion. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," the voices sang, "that saved a wretch like me." The walls that had once barely held back the winter wind now embraced a gathering of souls that the town would have thought impossible months ago. Ute children shared bread with settler children, their parents exchanging knowing looks of appreciation. The spring's clean water flowed freely outside, enough for all who came in need. As stars began to pierce the darkening sky outside, the homestead glowed like a beacon in the wilderness. Through the windows, lamplight spilled onto the path leading to their door, a path that had been worn smooth by many feet over the recent weeks. Inside, bowls were passed, stories were shared, and laughter rippled around the table. Hannah touched the worn wood of the table, remembering the day Aaron had first defended them in the auction yard. Who could have known that his act of mercy would grow into such abundance? The ridicule they had faced had transformed into respect, their shame into dignity. Clara laid the sleeping baby in a cradle near the hearth, tucking a small quilt around him. Ruth poured fresh spring water for their guests, her movements sure and peaceful. Aaron blessed the food with simple words of gratitude, and the meal began in earnest. The night deepened outside, but within the homestead, warmth and light prevailed. Here was proof that faith could outlast mockery, that courage could overcome fear, that mercy could heal deep wounds. The household had become more than shelter. It was a testament to the power of compassion in the harsh frontier lands. As the stars wheeled overhead, lamplight continued to shine from the windows into the dark frontier night, a beacon of hope that could not be quenched. The widows, no longer burdens but pillars of strength, had found their true calling as keepers of water, hearth, and hope, their home a light in the wilderness for all who sought refuge. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.